17-year-old Marcus Hayes was having a regular evening like any other. It was hot and sticky outside, the kind of summer night where everything feels slow, and the air clings to your skin. He stopped by the corner convenience store to grab a snack and a drink before heading home. The store was buzzing with activity, kids picking out candy, adults grabbing last-minute groceries, and the hum of the soda machine in the background. As Marcus walked out of the store, he didn't notice the two men leaning against the wall near the entrance. They were older than him, probably in their late 20s, and their eyes followed him as he stepped into the parking lot. Marcus had always been taught to mind his own business, so he didn't think much of it and kept walking. But then he heard footsteps behind him, quick and deliberate. "Hey, kid," one of them called out. Marcus turned, unsure if they were talking to him. Before he could respond, one of the men stepped in close, invading his personal space. The other circled behind him like a predator closing in on its prey. "You think you can just walk through here without showing some respect?" the first man sneered. Marcus' heart pounded. Respect? What did they even mean? "I don't want any trouble," Marcus said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. The second man chuckled darkly. Too late for that. What happened next felt like a blur. One of them shoved Marcus hard, making him stumble backward. When he tried to push past them, a fist connected with his shoulder, then another jab to his side. It wasn't a full-on beating, but it was enough to leave him gasping for air, his pride and body bruised. The men finally backed off, laughing as they walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, shaken and confused. For a few moments, he just stood there, frozen. His mind raced. Should he call his parents? Go back inside the store? Or maybe just go home and pretend this never happened? But deep down, he knew that wasn't right. He had been wronged, and he deserved justice. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed the non-emergency number for the police. "I need to report an assault," he said when someone picked up. The operator transferred him to the nearest station, and they told him to come in and file a report. When Marcus arrived at the station, he felt small. The place was cold and unwelcoming, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and officers busy typing or chatting among themselves. He sat on a hard plastic chair until an officer finally called him over to a desk. The man behind the desk was Captain Richard Monroe. He had sharp features, graying hair, and a look that made Marcus feel like he was already being judged. "What can I do for you?" Monroe asked, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. Marcus explained what had happened, trying to stay calm. But Monroe didn't seem to care. He interrupted with questions like, "Why were you there in the first place? And are you sure you didn't provoke them?" By the end of their conversation, Marcus felt worse than when he'd walked in. Monroe promised to look into it, but the tone of his voice made it clear he wouldn't. Marcus left the station, his stomach sinking. He wanted to believe in justice, but now he wasn't so sure. Marcus walked out of the police station feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. He had done what he was supposed to do, reported the assault to the authorities. But instead of finding help, he felt dismissed. The memory of Captain Monroe's cold stare and skeptical questions replayed in his mind. "Why were you even there? Are you sure it happened the way you said?" Marcus clenched his fists, trying to shake off the frustration. The night was quieter now, the streets nearly empty as he made his way home. His house, a modest two-story in a neighborhood filled with families like his, felt like a haven. Inside, the scent of his mom's cooking greeted him, a mix of spices and warmth that always made him feel safe. His mother, Lisa Hayes, was in the kitchen packing up leftovers when she heard the door open. She turned, smiling at first, but her expression quickly changed when she saw Marcus. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but he couldn't hide the bruises or the defeated look on his face. "I got into some trouble outside the store," he admitted, avoiding her eyes. Lisa dropped the container she was holding and hurried over to him. "What kind of trouble? Who did this to you?" "It's fine," Mom, I went to the police. They'll handle it, Marcus said, trying to sound convincing. But the way he slumped into a chair gave him away. Lisa's brow furrowed. You went to the police. Did they take your report seriously? Marcus let out a bitter laugh. Not really. The captain acted like it was my fault, like I was wasting his time. Lisa shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. This isn't right, Marcus. You shouldn't be treated like this. She wanted to call the station, demand answers, but Marcus stopped her. Mom, don't. It'll just make things worse. I'll deal with it, he said, though he wasn't sure how. Lisa sighed, her hand resting on his shoulder. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone. Your dad should know about this when he gets back. At the mention of his father, Marcus felt a pang of uncertainty. His dad, Benjamin Hayes, was always traveling for work, managing his many businesses and charities. He was a quiet, reserved man who rarely talked about his accomplishments. Marcus admired him, but wasn't sure how he'd react to this. Would he be disappointed? Tell Marcus to forget about it. For now, Marcus decided to keep it to himself. He didn't want to burden his dad with more problems. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, the weight of the day pressed on him. He couldn't shake the feeling of being powerless, of being seen as unimportant by the very people who were supposed to protect him. He thought about the two men who had attacked him. Were they still out there, laughing about what they'd done? Marcus clenched his jaw. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let this go. Something had to change. Even if the police didn't believe him, he had to find a way to make his voice heard. A week passed, but nothing changed. Marcus waited for a call from the police station, hoping they'd update him about his case. His phone stayed silent. Each day that went by, the anger inside him grew. It wasn't just about the assault anymore. It was about being ignored, like his pain didn't matter. At school, Marcus tried to focus on his classes, but the whispers and stares from classmates who had heard about the incident didn't help. A few friends checked in on him, offering support, but even their kind words couldn't shake the feeling that he was on his own. At home, things felt just as heavy. His mom, Lisa, was constantly checking on him, her worry showing in the way she hovered. She had always been protective, but now she seemed ready to fight anyone who looked at Marcus the wrong way. His dad, Benjamin Hayes, was finally back from his latest trip. The tall, composed man was a picture of calm authority, but Marcus still hadn't told him about the attack. It wasn't that he didn't trust his dad. He just didn't know how to bring it up. Benjamin was always busy with work, running the family foundation, attending meetings, organizing community events. Marcus didn't want to add to his plate. One evening, the family sat down for dinner. The table was filled with his mom's usual spread: baked chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, but the mood felt tense. Lisa glanced at Marcus every few minutes, as if silently urging him to speak up. Finally, Benjamin broke the silence. Marcus, you've been quiet lately. Everything okay? Marcus hesitated, staring down at his plate. Yeah, I'm fine, he muttered. Lisa frowned. Tell him, Marcus. He needs to know. Benjamin's sharp gaze shifted to Marcus. Tell me what? With a deep breath, Marcus finally told his father everything. The assault, the trip to the police station, and how Captain Monroe had dismissed him. His voice shook as he spoke, the words spilling out in a rush. When he finished, Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away, which made Marcus even more nervous. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Benjamin asked, his tone calm but firm. I didn't want to bother you, Marcus admitted. You've got enough going on. Benjamin's face softened slightly. Marcus, nothing is more important than your safety. This isn't something we can ignore. Lisa jumped in, her voice heated. The way that Captain treated him was unacceptable. Something needs to be done. Benjamin nodded slowly, his mind already working. You're right. I'll look into this. Marcus wasn't sure what his dad meant by that, but there was something about the way he said it that gave him hope. Benjamin Hayes wasn't the type to make empty promises. Later that night, while Marcus tried to focus on homework, he overheard his dad on the phone. The deep, commanding tone of his voice made it clear this wasn't a casual conversation. Marcus caught a few words. Monroe, department, unacceptable. It sounded like his dad was already taking action. For the first time in days, Marcus felt a flicker of relief. Maybe his dad could do something after all. Little did he know, Benjamin Hayes had more power than Marcus ever imagined. A few days later, the town's annual community gala was the talk of the neighborhood. It was a fancy event held at the town's largest banquet hall, with local leaders, business owners, and influential residents all in attendance. Marcus never cared much for events like this, but it was a big deal for his family. His dad, Benjamin Hayes, was one of the event's major sponsors through his family foundation. Marcus had decided to stay home, still feeling worn out from everything that had happened. He was stretched out on the couch, half watching TV, when his mom called from the upstairs hallway. "Marcus, you sure you don't want to come? It might be good to get out for a bit." "I'm good, Mom," he replied, not looking away from the screen. He didn't feel like being around crowds, especially one filled with people who might have already heard about his attack. At the gala, the room was buzzing with chatter and clinking glasses. Benjamin arrived in his usual understated style, quiet confidence, a simple black suit, and a firm handshake for everyone who greeted him. Despite his wealth and influence, he was known for being approachable, someone who truly cared about the community. Captain Richard Monroe was also there, representing the police department. He didn't like these kinds of events, but he knew they were necessary for keeping up appearances. The department relied on donations and partnerships with local businesses, and this gala was a prime networking opportunity. Monroe was standing near the buffet table, chatting with a fellow officer, when he overheard someone mention Benjamin Hayes' name. He turned, curious, as the speaker continued. "The Hayes Foundation really keeps this town running. Did you know they're the biggest contributors to the police department's community programs?" Monroe froze for a moment, his mind racing. He had heard the name Hayes before, but hadn't made the connection. Could this Benjamin Hayes be related to that kid he'd brushed off last week? He shook off the thought. It was probably just a coincidence. The evening continued with speeches and awards, the highlight being a presentation about the Hayes Foundation's contributions. When Benjamin stepped onto the stage to accept a plaque of appreciation, Monroe's suspicions were confirmed. As the man spoke, thanking everyone for their support and pledging continued efforts to improve the town, Monroe felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. Back at home, Marcus was scrolling through social media when he saw a post about the gala. It was a picture of his dad on stage, holding the plaque, with a caption praising his foundation's generosity. Marcus stared at the screen, pride swelling in his chest despite himself. His dad was making a difference in the community, even if Marcus hadn't fully appreciated it before. Meanwhile, Monroe's night ended on a sour note. As he left the gala, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. If Benjamin Hayes ever found out how his son had been treated, it could spell trouble for him and the department. For the first time, Monroe felt something he hadn't in years: accountability. He decided he needed to address the situation before it spiraled out of control. But he had no idea just how much Benjamin Hayes already knew. The morning after the gala, Captain Richard Monroe sat in his office, staring at the glowing screen of his computer. He couldn't focus on the reports in front of him. His thoughts kept circling back to Benjamin Hayes. That speech, that connection, that name. Monroe wasn't one to get nervous easily, but the realization that the teenager he dismissed was the son of the town's biggest philanthropist made his palms sweat. The Hayes Foundation didn't just fund after-school programs and park renovations. It also provided significant support to the police department. From new equipment to community outreach initiatives, their contributions were crucial to keeping the department running smoothly. Monroe picked up the phone and called his secretary. "Get me a meeting with Mr. Hayes," he said curtly, his tone betraying his discomfort. He wasn't exactly sure what he'd say, but he figured he'd try to smooth things over before any complaints came his way. That afternoon, Benjamin Hayes was sitting in his office, sipping coffee and going over foundation reports when the call came. His assistant poked her head in. "Captain Monroe from the police department wants to meet with you. Says it's urgent." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "Monroe," he repeated, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Interesting. Tell him I can see him tomorrow." When Monroe arrived the next day, he was greeted by the polished professionalism of Benjamin's office, a sleek, glass-walled space overlooking the town square. Benjamin stood as Monroe entered, extending a hand in greeting. "Captain Monroe, nice to finally meet you in person," Benjamin said warmly, though his sharp eyes missed nothing. Monroe shook his hand, feeling the weight of the moment. He wasn't used to being on the other side of the table. Normally, people were the ones explaining themselves to him. They sat down, and Monroe cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes, first, I want to thank you for all the support your foundation has given to the department. It truly makes a difference in what we can accomplish." Benjamin nodded politely. "I appreciate that, Captain. But I'm curious, what brings you here today?" Monroe hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "I wanted to discuss an incident involving your son, Marcus." Benjamin's expression didn't change, but Monroe felt the air in the room shift. "Go on," Benjamin said, his tone calm but firm. Monroe stumbled through his explanation, claiming the department was reviewing Marcus' case and that they were taking it seriously. But Benjamin wasn't fooled. He leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze fixed on Monroe. "Let me ask you something, Captain," Benjamin said. "If Marcus hadn't been my son, would you even be sitting here right now?" Monroe opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was painfully obvious. Benjamin didn't wait for an answer. "My son came to your station, hurt and scared, looking for help, and instead of doing your job, you dismissed him. That's not just poor leadership. It's a failure of duty." Monroe felt like he was shrinking under Benjamin's stare. He had no defense, no excuse. Benjamin stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "You've got work to do, Captain. Start with fixing my son's case, and after that, you might want to think about how your department handles every case, not just the ones that involve people like me." Monroe left the office feeling humbled and exposed. For the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't untouchable. Meanwhile, Benjamin was already planning his next move. If the system had failed his son, it wasn't enough to fix this one case. He needed to ensure it didn't fail anyone else. The next few days felt like a whirlwind to Captain Monroe. He had no idea what he was getting into when he walked into Benjamin Hayes' office, but now he couldn't avoid it. Benjamin's words had stung him, and he knew he had to act fast. There was no way he could just ignore the situation with Marcus anymore. Monroe began to push the department to reopen Marcus' case. It wasn't easy. His fellow officers were less than thrilled with the extra work. Some questioned whether it was worth the trouble, especially after Monroe had already brushed it off. But the pressure from Benjamin Hayes was undeniable. The more Monroe thought about it, the more he realized how right Hayes had been. The department wasn't just failing Marcus, it was failing the community. Monroe knew this was his chance to fix things, not just for Marcus, but for the whole town. He called in 2 detectives, urging them to take Marcus' assault seriously and to investigate thoroughly. It wasn't just about solving this one case, it was about restoring faith in the police force, which had been shaken by his own careless handling of the report. Meanwhile, Marcus had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. He had been trying to keep a low profile, staying away from the drama at school, and keeping his head down at home. He didn't want to keep bothering his dad, even though Benjamin had promised to handle it. Still, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would change. That is, until one afternoon when he received a call from Detective Taylor, one of the officers now handling his case. "Marcus, we got some new information," the detective said, his tone more serious than Marcus expected. "We've tracked down the men who attacked you. They're in custody now. Marcus felt his heart race. It was happening. The men who hurt him were finally going to face consequences. It was a small victory, but it felt huge to him. He didn't know if it was his dad's influence, the department's genuine desire to do right, or just a combination of both, but he felt a glimmer of hope that had been missing for so long. As the case moved forward, Monroe began to feel the weight of his responsibility. He wasn't just working for the department anymore. He was working for the people he swore to protect. He visited the police station more often, checking in with the detectives to ensure the investigation was progressing. He even spent time talking to Marcus' friends and family, making sure they understood that things were being taken seriously now. But Monroe didn't stop there. Benjamin Hayes had made it clear that this was more than just one bad incident. It was a sign that the system needed to change. So Monroe began to push for reforms within the department, suggesting bias training, more community outreach, and a revaluation of how they handled cases involving young people of color. He spoke with other local leaders and tried to build a coalition that would make lasting changes. Back at home, Marcus noticed this shift in his father. Benjamin was often on the phone with officials, attending meetings, and working late into the night. He didn't always explain what was going on, but Marcus could tell that things were changing. His father's quiet determination had turned into a full-on crusade for justice, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and awe. One evening, as Marcus and Benjamin sat down to dinner together, Marcus finally found the courage to speak up. "Dad, I just want to say thank you. For everything you've done. For me. For the department." Benjamin looked up from his plate, surprised but pleased. "You don't have to thank me, son. I'm just doing what's right." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't realized he needed. "I know, but it means a lot." It wasn't over yet. The case was still ongoing, and the department's reforms would take time. But for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like things were moving in the right direction. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. And for the first time in his life, he had hope that the system could change. Weeks passed, and the ripple effect of Marcus' case began to spread throughout the town. The police department had not only arrested the men who attacked Marcus, but had also started making significant changes in the way they operated. Monroe, once reluctant to make waves, had become a driving force behind reform within the force. He started leading meetings about improving how the department interacted with young people, particularly in marginalized communities. The changes were slow, but noticeable. There were new protocols for handling reports of assault, better training on racial bias, and more opportunities for community engagement. While the department's work wasn't perfect overnight, there was a noticeable shift in attitude. Officers began listening more, questioning their assumptions, and taking complaints seriously. For Marcus, it felt like the world around him was starting to change. He wasn't sure if it was all because of his case, but the conversations happening in town, especially at school, seemed different now. Teachers were talking about the importance of listening to each other, and students started opening up about their own experiences with injustice. It was like the cracks in the system were being exposed, and people were finally ready to fix them. One afternoon, as Marcus was walking home from school, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small group of officers was outside a local park, chatting with kids from the neighborhood, laughing and just talking. It was a far cry from the usual tense, distant relationship most of the community had with the police. Marcus recognized Officer Daniels, one of the newer recruits who had been part of the reform push. She smiled when she saw him. "Hey, Marcus. How you doing?" "I'm good," Marcus said, surprised at how casual she was. "It's cool seeing you out here." "We're trying something new," she said with a shrug. "The whole department's trying to rebuild trust. It's not going to happen overnight, but this is a start." Marcus nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. He wasn't sure how long it would last, but for the first time, he felt like there was a real effort to make things right. Back at home, Marcus' dad continued his quiet work behind the scenes. Benjamin was still deeply involved in the police department's reforms, meeting with town leaders, organizing forums, and making sure the conversation stayed alive. But his family was still his priority. One evening, Marcus found his dad at the kitchen table, looking over some papers when he came home. "I was thinking," Marcus started, his voice hesitant. "Do you think this will really work? I mean, the changes, the new programs, will they last?" Benjamin paused, putting down the papers and meeting his son's gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But I think it's worth fighting for. Change takes time. You can't fix everything overnight, but you can make a difference, one step at a time." Marcus thought about that for a moment. His father wasn't just talking about the police department. He was talking about life. Change was slow, frustrating, and often felt impossible. But it could happen. It had to happen. Weeks later, Monroe approached Marcus with news. The two men who attacked him were sentenced. It wasn't just about the punishment. It was about sending a message that no one in the community, regardless of their background, would be ignored or dismissed. Marcus felt a mix of emotions. He wasn't thrilled about the idea of the men facing jail time, but he knew it was necessary. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And for once, it felt like his voice had truly been heard. As time passed, Marcus began to focus on his future again. The assault, the pain, and the fear didn't define him anymore. He was determined to keep moving forward, to finish school, and maybe even help others who had been through what he had. The lessons from that difficult time stayed with him. How his father had used his influence for good, how the police had begun to change, and how his own courage had led to something greater than he could have ever imagined. Marcus didn't know where his life would take him next, but he knew one thing for sure. No matter what, he would keep fighting for what was right, not just for himself, but for everyone. And maybe, just maybe, the town was a little bit better because of it.